The first time I read Salman Rushdie was in Spanish. It was the Moor's Last Sigh. I like it so much that I reread it in English, but first I have to get a bigger dictionary. His first book, Midnight Children, he talks about uh, the independence of India from Britain, and also he talks about how the people moved from Pakistan to India and how colonial India divided itself. His books, even though they talk about fantasy, they reflect a lot of the world we live in. His latest book, Joseph Anton, a memoir, he not only talks about the reality of the world, but also the reality of his life when a writer has to go into hiding. Without more further ado, I want you to introduce and welcome Sir Salman Rushdie.
Hello, everybody. This is just saying that's quite a high percentage of the people here that I'm keeping from work. So, so that's good. Well, what I'm gonna do is talk for a little bit and read a little bit, and then hopefully answer your questions. Can you all hear fine? Yes. Okay. Most writers don't have interesting lives. Uh, you know, most writers, some of them go to the south of France, some of them go to bullfights. Mostly they sit in small, poorly lighted rooms and work. I acquired the problem of an interesting life. And I mean, this book is about that problem, really. But the writing mentality is a very bizarre one because even at the worst moment of your life, which essentially this was, there's a little voice of yourself sitting on your shoulder, whispering in your ear saying, good story. and encouraging you to do your best to remember it. And so somebody was asking me about keeping journals. I've never been the kind of writer who really kept detailed journals. Some of my friends do, but I never really had that temperament or patience. But when this episode began, when I was about 41 years old, so much was happening so fast that was so complex that I realized that no matter how good my memory might be, there was no way to remember it. There was no way to remember the dailiness of it, the step-by-stepness of it. What happened as it happened. And so I thought, because of this little voice in my head saying "good story," I thought I better write it down. I better start keeping a record. And so for about 12 years, I did keep a quite detailed journal, and then put it aside and didn't look at it again for many years until I started writing this book only, a few years ago. And when I went back to look at the journal, first of all, there's thousands of pages of it. I found it to be useful, but not in the way that I expected. That's to say, I thought there might be, stuff there that I could just more or less lift and put in the book. There was surprisingly little of that, surprisingly little material that I could just, cut and paste. Because for much of the time, the pressure on the person writing the book, the burden of the event was so great that the younger me that was writing the book was clearly not always in the best shape. And so what the journal became valuable for was as a record of my mental state, but how I was feeling, how I was dealing with it, how I was failing to deal with it, whatever. And so it became an insight into the life of a character called with my name. But it needed to be rewritten. It needed to be written from this point in my life, looking back. So I couldn't have done it without the journal, but it has very little to do with the journal, in terms of the actual sentences and the way it's written. The title comes out of the fact that I was asked at a certain point by the British Special Branch, which is the secret police essentially, the people who were there's a particular department of the Special Branch which does personal protection. It's called A Squad, and they protect the Prime Minister and other government ministers and other people who are thought to need it. Um, they wanted me to have a pseudonym, mostly so that they could train themselves not to use my real name by accident when they were in public. If they were round the corner from where I was staying at a supermarket and accidentally said, "Oh, Salman asked us to buy a packet of crisps," or some candy, and then that would blow the whole protection, right? So they had to train themselves to use a name that wasn't my name, and so they said, "Think of something," and I didn't know what name to choose. I've never been the kind of writer who was interested in pen names. There are writers who very successfully spend their careers writing under names not their own. John le Carré, for example, who was really called David Cornwell, um, and Anthony Burgess, whose real name was John Anthony Burgess Wilson, and used his middle names as his writing name. But I never was at all interested in having any name on my books other than mine. And then suddenly I had to have a name in real life that wasn't mine. And in the end, I just decided to start fooling around with names of writers that I admired and putting them together and seeing if they worked. And in the end, I mean, there were some kind of comically bad attempts like this, like Marcel Beckett. Nobody's called Marcel Beckett. um, but Joseph Anton, which came from Joseph Conrad and Anton Chekhov, seemed to have the merit of sounding like a name somebody might actually have. And that was the main reason for choosing it, just that it sounded convincing. But in the end, I came to feel that both Conrad and Chekhov had something to do with the condition that I was in. Um, Chekhov, particularly in his plays, is a great master of writing about people in a state of isolation and loneliness and people wanting to be somewhere other than where they're stuck. His three sisters yearning to return to a Moscow to which they can't return. And I thought, well, I know how that feels, you know. And so I felt there was a part of me that had fallen into a kind of Chekhovian atmosphere. And Conrad, first of all, wrote a lot about spies and secret agents and, about this kind of underworld of intelligence and espionage and sabotage and so on. Um, and so I thought somehow I was in this bizarre world which was both Conradian and Chekhovian. If you imagine, these two writers couldn't be more unlike each other. And that suggests how surrealist the reality was. Um, one of the characteristics it had, this took about 12 years, and everybody thought it would take a few weeks, a few days. When this began, when the attack on the Satanic Verses and its author and publishers and so on first began, it was so outrageous that the head of a foreign country should order the assassination of a citizen of Britain in his own country who had committed no crime in that country and to threaten to send killers to carry it out. Everybody thought, the politicians thought it, the police thought it, this can't stand, this has to be stopped. And I remember the police saying to me when they first came to offer protection, they said, look, we just have to go away for a few days. You just have to lie low for a few days, find a hotel in the countryside. We'll just go there and just keep your head down, stay out of the papers, and, let the politicians do their work, let the diplomats do their work. This is going to get fixed, because it has to get fixed. It's outrageous. So everybody went into this thinking it was going to take a few days. And when I left my house on that basis, I thought, okay, it's going to take a while and then everything's going to quieten down and I'll be home. Well, it took 12 years. And this is really the story of those 12 years. And one of the characteristics this period had of living with police officers and worrying about all these larger issues in the world is that there were many moments where it was ridiculously funny. And that's something you wouldn't expect. But it had the characteristic of being simultaneously funny and not funny. The thing that was not funny was funny. And I mean, I remember being taken at one point to have dinner at the house of my friend, the British Pakistani writer Hanif Qureshi. And when we left at the end of the evening, one of the policemen forgot his gun. and, and of course, this is Hanif was overjoyed by this and came running out into the street holding the gun by the barrel, waving it like this, shouting, "Here, you forgot your shooter." so, so this is a ridiculously kind of farcical comedy, you know. Um, there was a moment when my then very young son, he's now grown up, and I were taken by the police to a kind of fun fair, kind of holiday fun fair, and there was there was one of those shooting gallery places with, and my little boy decided there was a particular soft toy on the top shelf that he particularly liked. And I tried to explain to him that, to get the one on the top shelf, you basically have to hit all the ducks. And it's kind of impossible because these guns that they give you are all bent out of shape and the sights don't work and it's sort of a scam. And one of the police officers who we used to call Fat Jack, because his name was Jack and he was fat. um, um, he overheard me talking to Zafar about this, and he came over and he said, which toy does he fancy then? And I said, where's that one up there? And he said, oh, all right. And he went over and put down his pound coin and was given his terrible little shooting weapon. And he looked at it and he kind of went, okay. He went, boom, 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 boom. Knocked everything down. And there's the kind of poor kind of fairground guy going, it's never seen anybody shoot like this. And he got all of them, and then he turned to the guy and he said, yeah, we'll have that one, please. so there were these sort of moments which were ridiculous in a way. I want to read you, there was for a long time, it was more or less impossible for me to go anywhere, except be in England in this strange cocoon. But gradually, I knew that I had to kind of fight back, and there was the beginning of a kind of what became quite a large political campaign around the world to get political support, to get this thing removed, which did in the end work. It was the whole traveling thing was often very difficult, but the first time I was able to come to the United States was about 2 years in, and I'd been invited to address a free speech conference at Columbia University, and I managed to get over to New York. And I wanted to the NYPD got a little overexcited. So I just wanted to read you, it'll show you what I mean about funny and not funny. Let's have a find it now. Excuse me, I have to change my glasses. Yeah. Oh, the book is written in the third person, so I'm not I, I'm he. And that's in a way just to make a slight distinction between the author writing the book and the author being written about, as being not exactly the same person, not at the same point in their lives, etc. Anyway, he. So this is, just arriving in New York. He was met on the tarmac at Teterboro Airport in New Jersey by a 9-car motorcade with motorcycle outriders. The central car was an armored white stretch limo. That was his car. In charge of the very large number of NYPD officers involved was Lieutenant Bob Kennedy, known for the day as Hudson Commander. Lieutenant Bob introduced himself and explained the scenario, often breaking off to speak into his sleeve. Roger, Hudson, look out. This is Hudson Commander. Out. Roger that. Policemen nowadays spoke the way they had seen policemen speak on TV. Lieutenant Bob, it was clear, thought he was in a major movie. We'll be moving you through the city to the hotel in this vehicle right here, he said redundantly, as the motorcade set off. Lieutenant Bob, he said, this is a lot. The 9 vehicles, the motorbikes, the sirens, the flashing lights, all of these officers. Wouldn't it actually be safer just to drive me through the back streets in a used Buick? Lieutenant Bob looked at him with the pitying look people reserve for the chronically stupid or insane. No, sir, it would not, he replied. Who else would you do something on this scale for, Lieutenant Bob? Sir, this right here is what we do for Arafat. It was something of a shock to be bracketed with the leader of the Palestinian Liberation Organization. Uh, Lieutenant Bob, if I was the president, how much more would you do? Sir, if you were the president of these United States, we'd close down a whole bunch of these side streets here, sir, and so we'd have snipers on the rooftops along the route, but in your case, we didn't think that was necessary because it would look too conspicuous. The inconspicuous 9 vehicle motorcade rolled towards Manhattan with motorcycle sirens blaring and lights flashing, attracting no attention at all. Um, my agent, Andrew Wiley, was waiting for him at the hotel. In the presidential suite, there were bulletproof padded mattresses covering all the windows, even though they were on the top floor. And there were perhaps 24 men holding gigantic science fiction weapons scattered through the rooms. So there's a brief episode there where I was visited by Susan Sontag and Allen Ginsberg. Allen Ginsberg made us sit on the floor cross-legged and meditate. A little while later, Elizabeth was my girlfriend then. She became my wife. She's the mother of my younger son. A little while later, Elizabeth arrived, unannounced, and Lieutenant Bob brought her in to see him, surrounded by armed men. It's okay, Lieutenant Bob, he said. Elizabeth's cool. Elizabeth's with me. Kennedy narrowed his eyes. If I wanted to kill you, sir, he said insanely, wearing his best crazy Jack Nicholson look, she's exactly who I'd send. I said, how so, Lieutenant Bob? Kennedy gestured towards the table on which there was an arrangement of fruits and cheeses as well as cutlery and plates. Sir, if she were to take one of those forks there, sir, and stab you in the neck, I'd lose my job, sir. Andrew Wiley was finding it difficult to keep a straight face, and Elizabeth was known as the mad forkist for the rest of the trip. That evening, they were in the armored white stretch limo in the middle of the 9 vehicle motorcade with the motorcycle outriders and the sirens and the flashing lights, zooming down 125th Street towards the Columbia campus at 60 miles an hour, with the whole of Harlem out on the sidewalk, watching the low-profile operation ghost almost imperceptibly by. And Andrew was screaming with delight at the outrageousness of it all. This is the best day of my life. Then the fun, the slightly hysterical black comedy fun was over. He was concealed behind a curtain at the low library, and when his name was announced, there was a shocked gasp as he moved forward out of invisibility into the light. Then there's pause. Then I had to make my speech. And as I say here, the moment the speech was over, America unceremoniously threw him out. It was literally, I wasn't even allowed to spend the night. But you see what I mean? That it's simultaneously ridiculously funny and not funny at all. And that was this surreal characteristic persisted through those years. I mean, of course, there were moments which were not at all funny, which were very dark and serious and difficult. But anyway, I wanted to say that one of the reasons I think that I'm standing here, and one of the reasons why this story ended the way it did, is because there was a colossal collective act of support, which was not, from governments and politicians and so on. I mean, as usual, they were somewhat late to the party. It was from ordinary people. It was from people running. I've always felt that the bookstores were the front line of this thing. The bookstores were where there was physical danger to people working there and to the property. There were, Cody's bookstore in Berkeley, California, was pipe bombed, and there were firebomb attacks elsewhere in this country and in many other countries. There were physical threats to the staff of bookstores and so on, and yet the booksellers of America and the world, just simply refused uh, to be defeated and put the book in their windows and recommended it and sold it and kept it in print. And the combination of that effort with that of publishers and around the world, translators, and just ordinary people not wanting their rights as readers to be determined for them by the Ayatollah of Iran, meant that we were able to resist this threat. And in the end, we did get politicians involved, and they did negotiate an ending to it with the Iranian government. But I've always felt very proud and grateful to have been part of that collective act of principle, if you like. And I hope that if somebody else were in such a situation, that we would all do that again. But I also hope that nobody else is in such a situation. And one of the things that's interesting about time having passed, it's now actually just over 25 years since the first publication of the Satanic Verses, which came out in England in September 1988. One of the things that's interesting about the intervening years is how many of the people who were involved in protests against the book at that time now say that they regret it. Some of them regret it for tactical reasons. That's to say, they felt it didn't work. They say he just sold more copies and became more famous, and it didn't help the community. It backfired. But other people, which is true, uh, other people have actually internalized the free speech argument and believe that, if they have the right to talk about their opinions, and other people have the right to say things which conflict with those opinions. And so it's been an interesting exercise, because I hope that whole arc of a quarter of a century reduces the likelihood that these tactics would be used again against a writer or artist, um, at least in the Western world. I mean, there are many writers and artists in other countries who are under attack, and not by any means only in the Islamic world. I mean, in fact, one of the big areas of problems now, as you probably know, is China, where the attacks on literary and journalistic freedom are very, very severe. Um, anyway, so it's an exemplary tale, if you like. And I mean, I also feel, what I try and say in the book, that when this began, it felt like a bizarre, small, isolated episode. And I think now that we know what we know about what has happened in the last 25 years, we can see it as part of the arc of the rise of radical Islam, and you could draw lines of connection from these initial attacks on individual writers and journalists and so on, to the much larger attacks that we all know about. And at the beginning of the book, I use the metaphor of Alfred Hitchcock's movie, The Birds, that, when in that famous scene in the school playground, when the first bird comes and settles on the climbing frame outside the schoolroom, it's just a bird. It's just a bird sitting on a climbing frame. It's only in retrospect, when the sky is full of hostile birds, that you begin to think, oh yeah, there was that first bird. And I think it became, in a way, the fate of the Satanic Verses and its author and publishers to be the first bird. That was like the beginning of what became a storm. Um, and that's why I think this story of what happened to me and the people around me has, if you like, a kind of larger resonance. And I hope, if you read the book, that you may feel that too. I want to, just before I stop and answer your questions, one of the things, if you're by nature a satirist, if your basic, your default setting is to send up people in power and to take things apart and so on, it's much easier for somebody of that tendency to know what they're against than to know what they're in favor of. Because satire, by its nature, is against things. It deflates pomposity, it exposes tyranny, so on. It became very clear to me very early on in this business that that wasn't enough, that wasn't going to be enough, that for me to, not just for me to argue my case, but also actually for me to survive the event and come out the other end, I would have to know not only what I was against, but what I was for. And in this case, what I was against was pretty straightforward. I mean, killing writers because of books they wrote, I was against that. and that was kind of an easy question. But what are you in favor of? And to ask yourself the question, is there anything that you would be willing to sacrifice your life for? What is it? Is it worth your life being in danger for this? And if so, why? And these are tough questions to ask yourself when, in fact, you're really in that situation. And I think I came out of it with just, first of all, a very much clearer, stronger understanding of the value of free speech, of the principles enshrined in the First Amendment, and also a clearer and deeper understanding of what literature could bring to that narrative. And I just want to read you a few pages from near the end of the book, which talk about that. What do books have to do with this insane world that we now inhabit? This is written. This is deals with a passage, a moment in time, which is not just after the 9/11 attacks, really, in New York, which is where I was living by then. The story of his little battle was coming to an end. The prologue was past, and now the world was grappling with the main event. It would have been easy after everything that had happened to him, and after the enormity of the crime against this city, to succumb to hatred of the religion in whose name these things were done, and of its adherents too. Anyone who looked even vaguely Arab experienced some of that backlash in those weeks and months of aftermath. Young men wore T-shirts reading, "Don't blame me, I'm Hindu." Drivers of yellow cabs, many of whom had Muslim names, decked out their taxis with flags and patriotic decals to ward off their passengers' rage. But in this matter of wrath, too, the city on the whole showed restraint. The many were not held guilty of the crimes of the few. And he, too, refused anger. Rage made you the creature of those who enraged you. It gave them too much power. Rage killed the mind, and now more than ever, the mind needed to live to find a way of rising above the mindlessness. He chose to believe in human nature and in the universality of its rights and ethics and freedoms, and to stand against the fallacies of relativism that were at the heart of the invective of the armies of the religious, "We hate you because we're not like you," and of their fellow travelers in the West too, many of whom disappointingly were on the left. If the art of the novel revealed anything, it was that human nature was the great constant in any culture, in any place, in any time. And that, as Heraclitus had said 2,000 years earlier, a man's ethos, his way of being in the world, was his daimon, the guiding principle that shaped his life. Or, in the pithier, more familiar formulation of the idea, that character was destiny. It was hard to hold on to that idea while the smoke of death stood in the sky over Ground Zero, and the murders of thousands of men and women whose characters had not determined their fates were on everyone's mind. It hadn't mattered if they were hard workers or generous friends or loving parents or great romantics. The planes hadn't cared about their ethos. And yes, now terrorism could be destiny, war could be destiny, our lives were no longer wholly ours to control. But still, our sovereign natures needed to be insisted on, perhaps more than ever, amid the horror. It was important to speak up for individual human responsibility, to say that the murderers were morally responsible for their crimes, and neither their faith nor their rage at America was any excuse. It was important at a time of gargantuan inflated ideologies, not to forget the human scale, to continue to insist on our essential humanity, to go on making love, so to speak, in a combat zone. In the pages of a novel, it was clear that the human self was heterogeneous and not homogeneous, not one thing but many, multiple, fractured, and contradictory. The person you were for your parents was not the person you were with your children. Your working self was other than yourself as a lover, and depending on the time of day and your mood, you might think of yourself as tall or skinny or unwell or a sports fan or conservative or fearful or hot. All writers and readers knew that human beings had broad identities, not narrow ones, and it was the breadth of human nature that allowed readers to find common ground and points of identification with Madame Bovary, Leopold Bloom, Colonel Aureliano Buendia, Raskolnikov, Gandalf the Grey, Oscar Matzerath, the Makioka sisters, the Continental Op, the Earl of Emsworth, Miss Marple, the Baron in the Trees, and Salo, the mechanical messenger from the planet Tralfamador in Kurt Vonnegut's Sirens of Titan. Readers and writers could take that knowledge of broad-based identity out into the world beyond the pages of books and use the knowledge to find common ground with their fellow human beings. You could support different football teams, but vote the same way. You could vote for different parties, but agree about the best way to raise your children. You could disagree about child rearing, but share a fear of the dark. You could be afraid of different things, but like the same music. You could detest each other's musical taste, but worship the same God. You could differ strongly on the question of religion, but support the same football team. This was what literature had always known. Literature tried to open the universe, to increase, even if only slightly, the sum total of what it was possible for human beings to perceive, understand, and so finally to be. Great literature went to the edges of the known and pushed against the boundaries of language, form, and possibility to make the world feel larger, wider than before. Yet this was an age in which men and women were being pushed towards ever narrower definitions of themselves, encouraged to call themselves just one thing, Serb or Croat or Israeli or Palestinian or Hindu or Muslim or Christian or Baha'i or Jew. And the narrower their identities became, the greater was the likelihood of conflict between them. Literature's view of human nature encouraged understanding, sympathy, and identification with people not like oneself, but the world was pushing everyone in the opposite direction, towards narrowness, bigotry, tribalism, cultism, and war. There were plenty of people who did not want the universe opened, who would in fact prefer it to be shut down quite a bit. And so when artists went to the frontier and pushed, they often found powerful forces pushing back. And yet they did what they had to do, even at the price of their own ease and sometimes of their lives. Okay. All right, I'll stop there and see what you have to talk about. Thanks.
Hello. Who wants to? Does anybody has a question for Mr. Rushdie?
How concerned are you that even though the fatwa was officially withdrawn about 20 years ago, that someone will take it upon themselves to nevertheless threaten your life again?
None of you look very dangerous to me. I think I'm probably okay. No, I mean, truthfully, it's been over now for longer than it went on for. I mean, it really is a long time ago. And one of the things we all know about the world we now live in is that the subject changes very fast. Last week's subject is irrelevant this week, and something that somebody really last thought about in 2002, is ancient history. And remember that a lot of the people who were first of all, the biggest danger actually was state-sponsored. The biggest danger was the danger emanating from the intelligence ministries of the government of Iran. That was the real threat, because up to a point you can look after yourself if there's somebody in the street who doesn't like you. What is very difficult is to deal with the apparatus of a state when it's aimed against an individual. And that we really, I mean, I can't really, without breaking all kinds of intelligence codes, tell you why I know this, but there basically was an agreement which seems to have been upheld, where the Iranians essentially called the dogs off, and the rest of it has been kind of. I mean, the worst thing that's ever happened to me is walking down a street in New York. A gentleman of Indian origin like myself came up to me, wagging his finger, and he said, "I just want to tell you that V.S. Naipaul is 10 times as good a writer as you." and I said, "Well, you must feel pleased now because now you've told me, And he said, "Yes, I just wanted you to know." And then he walked off. I thought, well, if that's the worst I have to do, I can handle that.
So you mentioned bookstores as a rallying place for a reaction to what was done to you. Obviously, independent bookstores and bookstores generally are not faring terribly well in this economy. On the other hand, a lot of books are delivered by means like Amazon that are basically impossible, very, very difficult to attack in a way that a neighborhood bookstore is not. How do you think things would have unfolded differently? Are you concerned about sort of what's happening to bookstores as they suffering more competition online? How do you think things would play differently? Are you concerned about those things?
Well, I mean, clearly this is a time of extraordinary transformation in the publishing industry, and a lot of that is because of, first of all, the kind of Amazon model for delivery, and then the arrival of ebooks in a big way. I mean, those two things have transformed and are transforming the industry, and I think there's a lot to be said. I don't think it's a simple yes/no thing. I mean, for example, the existence of something like Amazon makes it almost impossible to ban a book. I mean, I know, for instance, in India, there's still restrictions on the import of the Satanic verses. But if you want to download it to your Kindle, there's, it will show up in an instant. And it makes it kind of ludicrous that official ban on the hard copy book survives, when in fact it's very, very easy for anybody who wants to have access to the book. So that's a good thing. I think with many, I'm not alone in saying that the problem with the Amazon model is the endless driving of the price downwards to the point at which everybody's bankrupt except Amazon. And that's, I think, a big war that's being fought in publishing now about fair pricing. And in many ways, the antagonist in that war is Amazon. So Amazon is sort of on both sides of the fence. You know what I mean? And similarly, ebooks. My view is I don't care how people read as long as they read. I have no particular. I mean, I actually myself, I'm old school enough to like having a book in my hand. But if people want to read it on I read on an iPad too. If I'm traveling, I tend to read on an iPad because I don't want to carry 20 books with me, and I think that's completely cool. And there's also some interesting evidence which shows ebook sales plateauing. I mean, everybody thought it was just going to go like that, and real books were going to go like that, and that doesn't seem to be happening. It seems to be plateauing at somewhere around 30% of the industry, and a lot of independent booksellers will say to me that they're actually not doing that badly. That they're actually still. The book is an incredibly persistent object. People like it. It's in many ways a very high-tech object. You could drop it in the water and it does not lose its data. You could do all sorts of things. It's a very resilient object. I once destroyed a computer by spilling a can of Coke on it, and ever since then I've been a little contemptuous of computers and how easily destroyed they are. Um, Also, I mean, I noticed, for instance, when my archive was being, looked after at Emory University, they had some of the old computers. Here's supposed to be this most modern technology, but much of it is already obsolete. What's a floppy disk? You and it was actually very hard for them at Emory to retrieve information from these old computers in a way that was usable. Well, you could retrieve information from a book, even if it's several hundred years old. The technology doesn't date. Um, so there's all sorts of reasons why people just like the feeling of books. And I think actually they can coexist with ebooks quite well. I think that there's also some evidence that ebooks bring people into the world of reading who would not go to bookshops, but and the kind of instantaneousness of being able to, you see a book, you think, oh, that sounds interesting, you push a button, you've got the book. I mean, that's very attractive. There's evidence that people buy in more than one format. That people like me will have the hard copy book, and then if you're traveling, you don't want to carry the thing around with you, so you download it. Sometimes vice versa. People will download a book, and if they really like it, they will want to have the book. So this is just the next revolution. And I don't think, everything was supposed to kill books. Everything. Movies were supposed to kill books. Television was supposed to kill books. Every new technology that's emerged is supposed to spell the death of books, and none of it has. And so I think, may outlast all of this. When Apple is a thing of the past, people will still be reading paperbacks. So, I mean, I'm okay about it. I think I worry about, the thing I most worry about is this price battle, because there's a level at which publishers can be profitable, writers can make a living, and distributors, whether it's Amazon or a bookstore, can also do well. And if you go below that level, then yes, Amazon will be fine because it has the enormous gift of volume. Just everything is going through Amazon. So even if they're making a dime on a book, they've got so many books that it's going to be fine. But publishers will go bust, and writers won't be able to live. And so there's that. That's the fight right now, and I hope it comes out in a fair place.
I have a question here.
Yeah.
Hypothetically speaking, if you knew then what do you know now about the violent reaction to your work, what would you have done differently?
Okay, this is the question I've been asked most often in my life, once a week for 25 years, at least. and the answer is, I would have written the same damn book, because actually, I'm very proud of the Satanic Verses. I think I don't know what it means to say it's the best book I wrote, but I think it's for me a very important book of mine, and I can't imagine my body of work without it there. And also, writing books is a journey. Each book is a step on a road. I couldn't have written the book after it without having written it. So it's difficult to say there's 5 years of your life that somehow shouldn't have happened. I think I also think what is nice now, given that the storm has died down, is that people are finally able to read it just as a book, not as a kind of hot potato or something. And we discover that lots of people seem to like it, and also a lot of people realize, which you wouldn't know from what you read about it, that it's funny. A lot of people read it and say, who knew that it was funny? And the answer is, the reason nobody knew is that nobody told them. It's not a kind of gag line kind of funny, but it's a comic satirical novel. And what I think is that there's, in my view, the opinion of people who like it is at least as important as the opinion of people who don't like it, especially since the people who like it tend to have read it. and and the truth is that, if you're a writer of my kind, you're trying to write books that will last. You're trying to write books that will endure, and hopefully endure longer than the author, and the only way that books last, is if enough people like them. Books don't last because of scandal, because scandal always fades. And if the only merit of the book was that it was part of a scandal, then the book fades when the scandal fades. You know, every book that's lasted, say, 100 years has lasted because a lot of people loved it. That's it. It's the only thing. And so my view is that in the end, the people who like the book are the ones who have the last word. Because it's because of their fondness for the book that it survives. And so my view is, we had all the people who didn't like the book making their noise for long enough. They had their turn, And now maybe it's the turn of people who do like the book and don't have to make a noise about it. You don't have to march down the streets of cities in order to say, we love this novel. That tends not to happen, regrettably. I mean, I'd rather see those demonstrations, truthfully, but that tends to not happen. But I mean, I'm just happy that finally the book can be read as a book. It can have the ordinary life of a book. It took a long time to get there, but I think we're there.
One more question.
Do you feel that Google has had a positive or negative impact on free speech around the world, or perhaps no impact at all? And is there anything that you'd like to see us do that could further the cause of free speech?
Well, the question of freedom of speech is that it's something that has to be constantly defended. It's because it is, I'm sorry to say, constantly under attack, and so there's never a moment at which you think, okay, that's taken care of, because it's the new attacks bubble up all over the place in with many different hats on, I think it's very hard. I mean, there's a question I try and answer in the book: is that was this a victory or a defeat? And I think that if you look at the narrow focus of the particular attack on this particular work and its author, then I think we didn't do so badly. I mean, the book is still in print. It's in print in whatever it is, 4 languages, and the author's still around, and so I think if you look at the narrow focus, it doesn't feel like a calamity. I think we did okay. But if you look at the broader spectrum, then it's much more difficult to see this as a success, because I think there's no doubt that it had a chilling effect. That people are scared of approaching this kind of material, because they are afraid of violent reprisal. And of course, there have been other episodes in which there have been violent reprisals. And so I think the larger spectrum is much more problematic, that we seem to have entered a very intolerant age. And again, yes, I think Islam is very much or at least this particular interpretation of Islam is very much at the forefront of that. But it's not by any means only Islam. I mean, for instance, in India now, there's a very intolerant, extremist Hindu right wing, that is at least as violent, at least as prone to mob law, as anything that happened to me. So it's, I mean, eternal vigilance, that's the thing. You have to fight every battle. That's the problem. And the problem of fighting every battle is that very often you find yourself defending work that you don't like. Like that idiotic video that was made somewhere on this side of America, which was done to provoke a response, and I think got a much bigger response than the maker expected. But still, and it's a piece of crap, and there was a colossal, very violent response around the world. Now you find yourself saying, on the one hand, it's a detestable little thing, but on the other hand, you have to defend the rights of people to make detestable little things. And unfortunately, the free speech battle often hinges on issues like that, which are you're not defending great work, you're defending garbage. But there should be freedom of speech for the makers of garbage too, and that's the problem. And it's just that it seems to me the best way to respond to a piece of garbage on YouTube is to say there's a lot of that about. I mean, if you want to find something on YouTube that will really annoy you, it's there. It's there. Um, and the way to deal with it is just to say, well, that's what there is on YouTube, and get on with your day. You don't. I mean, going about burning the world down because there's something you don't like. There's a video on YouTube you don't like, seems to me to be kind of not grown up. You know, I mean, to give you a parallel example, when the musical The Book of Mormon opened on Broadway, the program, the show's producers invited some of the elders of the Mormon church to come and see the show right at the beginning. And they said that they thought it was very funny. And they took ads in the program saying, you've seen the show, now read the real Book of Mormon. And, end of story. So I mean, that seems to me to be, I mean, sorry to be defending the Mormon church, but, uh, but that seems like a grown-up response, you know. When there are all these fusses about this or that cartoon that somebody doesn't like, because it's disrespectful, I would say, what does a respectful political cartoon look like? I mean, there's no such thing. The form itself requires disrespect. So again, if we're going to live in an open society, we just have to deal with that. I mean, I remember last year I can't remember which paper here. I think some American paper. There was a cartoon of the Pope, not this Pope, the previous Pope, the one who's now called ex-Benedict. But when he was still Pope Benedict, there was a cartoon of him sitting at his desk in front of a desktop computer with a few cardinals gathered around him. And on the computer screen, there were pictures of little boys. And the caption said, yes, and then you just have to click on the boy that you like best. Now, American newspaper, pretty rude about the Pope. I mean, you may say reasonably rude about the Pope, but pretty rude. Did anybody run around burning cities down? They did not. Because it's the nature of liberty is that people must say things you don't like. It's very easy to defend the freedom of speech of people you agree with, or people whose opinions don't really bother you one way or the other. It's when people are saying things that you really don't like that you discover if you believe in free speech or not. And a lot of people don't. It turns out when it comes to that crunch, but it means that the battle is very often about defending the right of people to speak who are saying things you don't like. Because otherwise, other people can say that you shouldn't have the right to speak because you're saying something they don't like. And in the end, who makes those judgments? Where do you draw those lines? It's impossible to do it. What is best is to say, let it all out, let it all out and we'll deal with it. So I would say that's the nature of the battle and it never ends. Thank you.